Okay, welcome back, everyone. Both those in the virtual room here with us and the attendees listening in. We've got 3 papers for this final session. What we'll do is listen to the papers by Hiromi, Ochi, and Shintaro Kono first, and then discuss those papers. And then I'll invite Professor Dye-Smith to close proceedings with a paper. Hiromi Ochi will speak first and is Professor of American Literature at Senshu University. Her research interests include the literature of the American South and Cold War literary politics, and publications include modernism, publications on modernism, on Southern writers. I heard Hiromi, we were giving a paper together in Kyushu province a few years ago, and the paper was a very striking one on the miners of Harlan County in Appalachia, and engaged with questions of culture and class consciousness in ways that, well, were very much in the tradition of Raymond Williams, but perhaps also of the labor history that Dye-Smith and the late Powell Francis, amongst others, developed in Wales as well. Today, Hiromi's paper is 1955, Faulkner and Nagano as a media event. So a very warm welcome. Croeso cynnes, Hiromi.
Thank you. Thank you very much for giving me such a wonderful opportunity for presenting my paper. Let me share my slides. Can you see?
Yes, that works fine.
Okay, thank you. Yes, for me, interested in how American literature was institutionalized in post-war Japan, the Nobel laureate novelist William Faulkner's coming to Japan means a lot. Recently, I participated in a project of rethinking Faulkner in Japan, and during the conversation with one of the members of the project, Professor Yuko Yamamoto, the USIS film Impressions of Japan was that covers his trip in Japan, was significant when we put the film in the context of USIS Atoms for Peace campaign. Professor Yamamoto points out that Faulkner as a father figure functions as a patriarch who guides the family members of the free world, the nations of the Western Bloc, at the time of his visit. Japan was in social and political unrest when he comes to Japan. The year 1955 marked the 10th anniversary of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. If we count the tragedy of the tuna fishing boat Daigo Fukuryuma, Lucky Dragon number 5, that was showered with nuclear fallout from the Castle Bravo hydrogen bomb test shot at Bikini Atoll in March in 1954. Japanese people had a singular experience of getting nuclear bombings 3 times. This tragic incident fostered anti-nuclear movement. The success of the First World Conference against atomic and hydrogen bombs in Hiroshima on the 10th anniversary of the bombing helped establish Japan Council against atomic and hydrogen bombs in fall 1955. Also, there was a prolonged protest movement against the expansion of the Tachikawa Air Base of the US Air Force. In the age of dichotomy, pro-America or pro-Soviet, these movements were threatening enough for the US politicians. At the same time, the United States had been pushing their campaign of atoms for peace since 1953. It is to this Japan that Faulkner came as part of his world tour sponsored by the State Department. My question today is how the USIS film Impression of Japan could intervene from the cultural sphere in this anti-nuke and even anti-US political movement. How and with what intention this literary figure, Faulkner, was promoted at the earliest stage of TVH when, in Williams' words in television, quote, that which served an at once mobile and home-centered way of living, a form of mobile privatization, unquote, was yet to come. To reflect on Faulkner in Japan, first, I'd like to sketch the CIE USIS film project and its intention, and then move on to how television or experience of watching TV could work in those days. And finally, I'd like to think about the meaning of the father figure of Faulkner. At the very early stage of occupation, the Supreme Commander of Allied Power General Headquarters, SCAP GHQ, established the Culture, Information, and Education section. Its goal was, quote, to expedite the establishment of freedom of religious worship, freedom of opinion, speech, press, and assembly by dissemination of democratic ideals and principles through all media of public information, unquote. They opened CIE libraries in major cities, which would later become American cultural centers. They installed libraries, showed motion pictures, and had other cultural events there. One of the important missions was to promote the motion pictures. Okay, I'm sorry. And they showed more than 400 short documentary films concerning American culture, sanitary, science, industry, most of which were entertaining. CIE made movie tours around Japan, especially those areas without movie theaters. Also, they offered projector sets, provided necessary training in projector operation, and loaned films at request. CIE tried to redress uneven distribution of information, especially in country areas. Kenji Tanigawa reveals how those films were enjoyed by many people. According to his research, 330 films were shown during the years 1945 to 1951, and the number of views accumulated to more than 945 million, which means more than 10 films per person. Counting in the second and third round of the movies, it will increase the number radically. When Japan regained its sovereignty, the CIE was transferred to the United States Information Service, or US Embassy. While in the United States Information Agency, USIA, was separated from the State Department and launched its own public diplomacy activities in 1953. USIS in Japan succeeded CIE films and added newly produced ones and continued its loaning work. Those films were loaned and shown, especially in remote areas well into the 1970s, continually providing basic images of the United States. The USIS sometimes contracted Japanese film production companies to distribute feature films in commercial theaters, but the engagement of the USIS was totally kept secret. For example, Jet Vapor Trails in Dawn in Japanese, Jet-Ki Shutsudo Dai 101 Kokukichi, produced and distributed by Toei in 1957, was seen at more than 2,200 movie theaters by 15 million Japanese people. This movie contained a message about the necessity of longer runways, clearly implying protests against Tachikawa Yabe's expansion. Okay, first television. In the case of Japan, TV was not incorporated in households yet in the mid-1950s. Our public broadcasting organization, NHK, began its broadcasting program in 1953, followed by a private broadcasting company, Nippon TV. There were other developments that encouraged TV purchase. A first housing complex designed for nuclear families was completed, and American TV sitcom I Love Lucy and Papa Knows Best heralded the age when TV played a central role in nuclear family. The royal wedding as a happy ending of romantic love indeed spurred the purchase of TV sets, but still not when Faulkner came to Japan. So until then, TV was a luxury. Especially NHK was not allowed enough budget to cater to the small number of TV owners. I will go back to this topic later. So Atoms for Peace campaign. When President Eisenhower delivered the famous address of Atoms for Peace to UN General Assembly in December in 1953, expressing his deep concern for atoms for war, trying to solve this problem by developing this greatest of destructive forces into a great boon for the benefit of all mankind, unquote. The newly established USIA launched a large-scale Atoms for Peace campaign, mobilizing various media such as exhibitions, films, radio, TV, and magazines. Especially the USIS films was crucial. According to Yuka Tsuchiya, the USIA producing more than 50 films concerning atomic power by 1959, and they were shown in 80 countries, translated in 33 languages. 22 of those were shown in Japan by 1959, and especially during the years 1955 to 56. They had more than 1,300 film viewing occasions around Japan, attracted about 4 million viewers. Some of them were also on TV, reaching more than 300,000 people. Peaceful purposes of atomic power were supposed to help our everyday life, ranging from agriculture, industry, power plant, medical science, and so on. A is for Atom was produced by General Electric, which would provide nuclear reactors for Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station. This film follows the Eisenhower speech, The Fatal Power of Nuclear Power, with ominous background sound. Then Dr. Atom, he's the one, he's a doctor, teaches us how atoms work and how we can work atoms for peaceful purposes. And another one, Blessing of Atomic Energy, was produced by USIS Tokyo to show how isotopes provided by the United States served cancer treatment, agriculture breeding, and now X-rays were useful in industry and construction. Film program, I'm sorry. And this is from Tsuchiya and also the film program of United States Information Agency. The USIA promoted their program of Atoms for Peace exhibition worldwide since 1954. In Japan, the exhibition, Genshiryoku Heiwa Ryo Hakurankai, Atoms for Peace exhibition, was held in Hibiya Park in 1955, sponsored by a major newspaper publishing company, Yomiuri Shimbun, whose owner, Matsutaro Shoriki's close connection with the Central Information Agency, the CIA, is now well-known fact. This exhibition was fully financed by the USIS. The exhibition then moved to Nagoya, Kyoto, Osaka, Hiroshima, Fukuoka, Sapporo, Sendai, Mito, Okayama, and Takaoka, attending more than 2 million and about 2,600,000 visitors. The USIS film, Power for Peace, reports the first exhibition in Hibiya to address those who could not visit the site. Mitsuo Ikawa discovered before and after survey conducted by the USIS, which shows how visitors came to endorse the idea of visiting the exhibition. So when Faulkner visited Japan at the beginning of August in 1955, his trip was well covered by newspapers. His arrival, interviews, Nagano seminar, stay in Kyoto, and departure. His essays, Impressions of Japan, and To the Use of Japan, were printed in newspapers. I have not been able to access the news coverage of the radio, but NHK Radio 2 had a special program of his interview with Masami Nishikawa, a leading scholar of American literature, in September. That month, however, was full of events. He could not squeeze himself into newsreels for movie theaters. Two major ones, Asahi News and the Yomiuri International Newsreels, reported Wikidozan wrestling match, also the Japanese Communist Party chairman's death, the First World Conference against atomic and hydrogen bombs in Hiroshima, and so on. And there was no space for the novelist. And TV, as I mentioned a while ago, at the time of Faulkner's visit, TV network did not cover the whole country, and both NHK and Nippon Television started their program around noon and had intermission of 1 or 2 hours in the afternoon. So this is the intermission. I'm sorry. So intermission here, and then resumed their program and ended around 10 in the evening. Especially NHK did not have enough budget and depended on films offered by foreign information services like USIS. This slide shows a typical timetable of NHK. And Faulkner's Impressions of Japan, which was released by the USIS on the 10th November, got the last time slot of November 18th on NHK. It found a better slot at NHK Nagoya station around noon on the same day. Nippon TV broadcasted earlier on the 10th. If you look at the table of the day, it is always being interfered by programs offered by foreign information service like USIS and other embassies, and foreign broadcasting programs such as those from BBC. So we can find a program offered by Canadian Embassy, and also this is the Impression of Japan offered by USIS. Raymond Williams point out the expansion and invasion of the US system as a complex military, political, and industrial communication system, unquote, into other broadcasting systems. NHK exemplifies this process, and being a public broadcaster without a huge budget paradoxically invites such invention and such intervention and induces what William calls, quote, ambiguity about the public interest and especially about its relation to the state, unquote. The release of the Impressions of Japan coincided with the Atoms for Peace exhibitions. So the next part. Then, how can we understand potential intended effects of Impressions of Japan? If he is depicted as a father figure, that figure is not oppressive. He is a father in that he has experienced defeat already and can show how to live with it and recover from it. As for defeat, there were already two media events that gave a kind of satisfaction of pseudo victory to Japanese people by beating what defeated Japan. The professional wrestler Rikidozan and Godzilla. The wrestling match performed by Rikidozan and white wrestlers attracted a large number of public viewers. And this slide shows how we can see how many people were gathering to view the wrestling match. Of course, we couldn't see what was going on such a small TV screen. But the public viewing itself was probably meaningful. So the public viewers were excited to see him defeat white men bigger than him, as if Rikidozan revenged the former energy, gave a certain nationalistic enthusiasm to the mass viewing experience. The other is the popular film Godzilla, released in 1954. Part of the inspiration for Godzilla was the incident of Daigo Fukuryama, the tuna fishing boat contaminated with nuclear fallout from H-bomb at Bikini Atoll. In the film, Godzilla was annoyed by the H-bomb testing and lands on Tokyo, destroying the metropolitan city with its heat ray containing radiation. According to Shintaro and other scholars, the massive destruction brought by the dinosaur is said to be a reenactment of the bombing of Tokyo and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The annihilation of the dinosaur by using the oxygen destroyer, a fictive weapon of mass destruction, was carried out by self-sacrifice of a scientist whose desperate attack reminds us of the kamikaze attacks and the final stage of the Pacific War. The film, as Mori Arinori points out, provided the venue of solving the national trauma by restaging traumatic destruction that would be healed by a fictive victory. And here comes the defeat of the South. Already in 1952, the film version of Gone with the Wind marked a spectacular hit, and still in 1955, the film enjoyed a revival screening, and it was shown in many major cities in Japan. Many Japanese moviegoers identify themselves the heroine Scarlett O'Hara and her recovering from defeat. Faulkner also staged himself as a person who had gone through the experience of defeat and has something to share with Japanese people, especially in his essay To the Use of Japan that was translated in major newspapers. In the US, this is a November 1955 TV programs excerpted from the NTV and NHK. There are many USIS, atomic power something, and also Faulkner's film. In the USIS film that recorded his tour was carefully edited as part of the State Department's cultural diplomacy or people-to-people approach, as well as psychological warfare propagating the United States as a free country in the framework of US-Soviet dichotomy. Especially when the US government was afraid that the surging anti-atom sentiment would lead to anti-US sentiment, which may function as a foothold of communism to hold Japanese people in alliance with the US meant a lot. The USIS prepared 1100,000 copies of the essay To the Use of Japan and distributed them. The part of the film was screened for a week at the end of August in movie theaters around Japan. If we look at Impressions of Japan, Faulkner is depicted as a missionary of enlightenment. Okay. So it's really a kind of Orientalistic expression of representation of his trip. So please go to the next book.
Others do. The young students prying and prodding with their questions, wanting some message which they could call truth. And he, having no such authority, could only offer in all simplicity.
So the narration of this part, trying to ask many questions, and this was totally an addition by the USIS. By doing so, this movie tried to show Faulkner as a kind of enlightening person.
Wanting some message which they could call truth. And he, having no such authority, could only offer in all simplicity that each must seek not for a mere crutch to lean on, but to stand erect on his own feet, believing in his own toughness and endurance, realizing that man's hope is in man's freedom, not given as a gift, but as a right and a responsibility to be earned.
And that part is from To the Use of Japan. Okay, next part.
And questions. There's time to see something of the country by a man who knows a good deal of what we call country. This section of Japan is the one I know best. Your mountains are magnificent, a fine backdrop for the good, rich, fertile land where your rice grows. It's nice country. It's beautiful. This is the same rice paddy I know back home, where it replaces now and then the cotton. This one merely a little smaller and a little more fiercely cultivated. The work here done by hand, where in my country machines do it, since we have more machines than we have people. Here done by...
Okay. Also, his down-to-earth humanity is emphasized by his familiarity with the countryside and agriculture. This aspect of him was also highlighted in articles appearing in newspapers, especially the term farmer was somehow translated into Japanese words hyakusho and nomin, the words that rather approximate English words peasant or tenant farmer. But if we remember USIS emphasized the importance of the countryside, the Japanese translation may have endorsed the Faulkner's image of a common, nice guy. Okay, also go back to 450.
But who could write books which met their standards of what writing must be, yet who in trying to communicate human being to human being spoke in a mutual language much older than any intellectual tongue, because it is the simple language of humanity.
So stressing humanity and mutual understanding also fits into the cultural diplomacy's person-to-person approach for mutual understanding. So to quickly conclude, this film
in a mutual language much.
And this film was released just at the time of Atom for Peace exhibition at Hibiya Park was held, and it was screened on TV with other Atoms for Peace campaign products. Together with Faulkner's humble, modest attitude, his experience of defeat repeatedly told to Japanese people, including the essay To the Use of Japan, shows another example of acceptance of defeat and recovery from it. The film's Orientalist approach is an attempt to mitigate and revise the wartime brutal image of enemy Japan to people outside Japan. At the same time, presenting Faulkner as an enlightening enlightening father figure and a good countryman, helps the USIS mission of person-to-person approach, even reaching for the countryside people. His message endorsed the future of Japanese position in alliance with the US in the midst of the tension between anti-atoms and atoms for peace. He knew what was expected of him. In December, it was announced that the young scholar, Ms. Midori Sasaki, who were teaching in Hiroshima and attended Faulkner's Nagano seminar, would be the recipient of Faulkner Fellowship to study abroad in the United States. She was awarded the fellowship at the American Cultural Center, Hiroshima. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hiromi. That was fascinating, new to me, Faulkner's connection with Japan. But yeah, very interesting. I guess the connections with Raymond Williams were more implicit than explicit, although I could see quite a lot of what you were doing resonate with some of Raymond Williams's approaches, you know, not least the TV schedule and the concept of flow that he develops in the television book, the locating of Faulkner within the broader context of American sort of soft power and cultural diplomacy. 1955, I think, is also the year where the Jazz Ambassadors program is established, and presumably the centrality of jazz in post-war Japanese culture has something to do with the period you're looking at as well, which is of particular interest to me. But yeah, and some of those images, I mean, the crowds, there are no masses, only ways of seeing other people as masses. The crowd watching the wrestling match brought that to mind. Anyway, we can discuss after Shintaro's paper, but thank you very much. So Shintaro Kono is a professor at Senshu University, Tokyo, and in 2009 came with Takashi Onuki to Swansea, initiating what is now, 12, is it 12 years or 22 years? I'm losing count here. 12 years of correspondence and projects and so forth. He was with Takashi, Richard Burton Center Fellow at Swansea, a very memorable year when they both came over with their families in 2015 to 16. His published work includes Fighting Princesses, Working Girls in Japanese, The Genealogy of the Country and the City, and the wonderful little collection of Welsh short stories, The Dark World, which perhaps is one of the most significant products of our collaboration over the years. So a very warm welcome, Croeso Cynnes, as always, Shintaro.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for a very generous introduction. I have to warn you that I'm not talking from Wales. I have this picture at my back because we had originally planned a symposium last year around this time at this place, Big Pit. But as you know, the COVID situation, made it impossible for us to get together. So I'm very glad that we were able to do this today, and I appreciate you have for everything you have done, Daniel, to make it possible. So let me share. Which one is this? Okay. Okay, can you see my slide? Okay.
Yep.
So this summer, we in Japan faced two things: the Tokyo Olympics and the worsening condition of COVID-19. The Olympics had been postponed due to the outbreak of COVID-19, and this year, the Japanese government and the Tokyo government forced their way, despite the fact that this summer was far worse than the last in terms of the number of the newly infected. In July and August, news programs on TV were mostly occupied by reports on COVID and the Olympics. The effect of it was quite dizzying, to say the least. The news presenter reports the day's facts about COVID, including the number of the newly infected, the death toll, and how medical care was on the verge of collapse. Some news stations even adopted a critical stance towards the government's ineffective measures. But at the next moment, we see him or her switching magically, so it seemed to me, to the topic of Olympics, as if nothing had happened, as if there had been no COVID-19, as if the world had been going on as usual. Outside the TV screen, we knew there was much debate as to the appropriateness of holding the event in view of infection prevention, but inside the screen, we were involved in an uncanny forgetfulness. We were somehow supposed to know nothing about real world and be pure spectators of the games. I couldn't possibly swallow all of this. Perhaps you could say that the media, especially television, has been like this all the time. They have always been schizophrenic, and what we saw this summer was an exaggerated version of this. That is partly true. But the problem is then whether we should just turn the TV off and come back to the real world. The answer to that question is, of course, no. It is because we learned this summer that such an amnesiac and schizophrenic worldview or such an image of society did prevail, and indeed had prevailed all the time. In fact, the Tokyo Olympic Games were held basically as planned, and the death toll soared, and there was no way to prove the causal relationship between the two. On looking back, it was precisely because of this that Raymond Williams needed to talk about flow in his 1974 book, Television, a Japanese translation of which was published last year. The analysis of flow was needed because if you try to analyze or review each television items, I'm quoting from Television, it would be like trying to describe having read 2 plays, 3 newspapers, 3 or 4 magazines on the same day that one has been to the variety show and a lecture and a football match. And yet, in another way, it is not like that at all. For though the items may be various, the television experience has in some important ways unified them. To break this experience back into units and to write about the units for which there are readily available procedures is understandable, but often misleading, even when we defend it by the gesture that we are discriminating on experienced viewers and don't just sit there hour after hour googling at the box, unquote. Raymond tried to capture this unified television experience by the word flow. This is directly applicable to what I experienced this summer. It would be easy to analyze each news unit about COVID and about the Olympics separately. But once we put them together in a flow, it becomes suddenly very difficult to understand, especially when those units cancel each other as they do in this case. How can we make sense of this flow? And more importantly, what does it mean to capture our television watching experience as a unified whole? In order to understand this, we need to go back to the long revolution. The 4th chapter of the first part, which is entitled Images of Society, begins as follows, I quote, "Our thinking about society is a long debate between abstractions and actual relationships. The reality of society is the living organization of men, women, and children in many ways materialized, in many ways constantly changing. At the same time, our abstract ideas about society or about any particular society are both persistent and subject to change. We have to see them as interpretations, as ways of describing the organization and of conceiving relationships, necessary to establish the reality of social life, but also under continual pressure from experience," unquote. It is easily predictable that what gives abstract ideas about society or the images of society is the media. But it is also foreseeable that such binary is readily deconstructed. Our media experience, which provides us with abstract images of society, can nevertheless be actual, to use Raymond's favorite words. As a matter of fact, this chapter of the long revolution closes with these words. I quote, "This at least is my starting point, where learning and communication are actual, and where through them we see shapes of a society. What we see in this way, we can then try to put to use in a much wider area. We can try to say how, where we live, where we see growth and change, perhaps in new ways that are decisively altering our received social thinking," unquote. Communication or the media is actual. And from what he states about growth and change in the last sentence, we could make a bold paraphrase here and say that communication and media belong to the realm of the pre-emergent. The pre-emergent, which Raymond clearly formulated in his Marxism and Literature, is something that is not yet given a form. And it is very closely tied to the concept of the changes in the structure of feeling, which is defined as happening, I quote, "in the true social present." My present paper is a modest attempt to capture our true social present. In the rest of the paper, I will take up a very recent piece of work from Japanese literature, a controversy it raised, and its aftermath. What is interesting about the subject I discuss is that the work itself and the scandal it has raised have much to do with various media experience itself, and the images of society that we receive from this experience. In September issue of the literary journal Bungakukai, which was published in August, you see the cover of the journal on my slide. Kazuki Sakuraba published a novella called Bearing the Girl. Sakuraba is a winner of the Naoki Prize, a prize for popular literature, which is called Taishu Bungaku in Japanese. And Sakuraba basically had worked in the genres of light fiction, the novelization of video games and scenarios for games, etc., before she made her debut in Bungakukai, which is supposed to be a journal for so-called pure literature, Junbungaku in Japanese. Junbungaku could be variously translated as serious literature or highbrow literature. Please keep in mind these media specificities, which will be important in the latter part of my argument. Bearing the Girl is an autobiographical, almost journal-like novel. The protagonist and the first-person narrator, Fuyuko, is a novelist living in Tokyo. In February this year, she received a call from her estranged mother in Tottori, in western part of Japan. I put the map of Japan on my slide, and Tottori is here. Tokyo is here. Okay. I'm from Yamaguchi, this place. In a word, it is a countryside. Yes. And, okay, sorry. She tells her that her father, who has been ill for some 20 years and now is in hospital, is in a critical condition. The COVID-19 situation compels her to meet her father through a video app, and she apologizes for not coming back to see him for 7 years and for what she had done for her family, to her family. After a PCR test, she flies back to her hometown after 7 years absence. Being unable to see her father face to face due to COVID, Fuyuko spends some time at the hotel doing her work as a writer. On the day her father falls into critical condition, Fuyuko confronts her mother for the first time during the visit. It is revealed to the reader that her mother used to have, I quote, fits of anger, and her father endured amid such storms. But to Fuyuko's surprise, the mother claims that there were no such moments. Fuyuko's father passes away, and just before the coffin is closed, her mother apologizes him for, I quote, bullying him so much. From the conversation between Fuyuko and her mother, and from Fuyuko's monologue, the readers learn how Fuyuko escaped from her mother's control, which was a tantamount to escaping from the patriarchal and oppressive community in her country, Tottori. The mother had tried to have her daughter marry with a Shinto priest and, I quote, do her duty as a wife and write novels in her spare time, I quote, unquote. After returning to Tokyo, she finds that she has not really done away with the mask that she thought she had taken off when she escaped from Tottori long time ago. This mask is a mask of complacent submission to patriarchy, which Fuyuko's mother could never do without, despite her violence against her husband and Fuyuko. The novella ends with Fuyuko's strong conviction that she will not submit, that she will come out from the ground even after she's buried, as she has been so many times. Here, the meaning of the title becomes clear. She compares herself to a legendary girl who was buried under the stone wall of a castle in order to keep it from crumbling down. And Fuyuko closes her narrative by repeating in a loud voice, "The community is for individuals' happiness." So that's what the story basically is. Perhaps most of you may be thinking about a novel, which is obviously comparable with this one, Raymond Williams's Border Country. Both novels have the contrast between the country and the city as its backdrop, and both novels are return of the native novels, which have the problem of distance at the core. Both novels express the contrast by differences not only in speech, but in the tone of voice heard in the city and the country. Tottori is characterized by low voices, whereas in Border Country, Welsh speech is repeatedly characterized by its deep voices. Of course, there are some crucial and intertwined differences. One big difference, which concerns the very fabric of the novel, is the gender of the protagonist. Fuyuko is not from a working class family, but her cultural ascent and the distance from her home that she has achieved are obvious, as she is an established name who writes regularly for national newspapers and other prominent media. But the achievement of this distance is given a totally different emphasis as she's a woman. She's quite conscious that she succeeded in escaping from the oppressive patriarchal society of her hometown to Tokyo, where her individuated lifestyle itself epitomizes her emancipation. This in turn results in a widely different signification of the word community. In Burying the Girl, the community in the protagonist's hometown is given a far more negative meaning than that in Border Country. It is true that there are some moments in which Fuyuko finds it comforting to be submerged into the collectivity of her community, but that only turns out to be illusory after her bitter confrontation with her mother. As a result, the problem of distance between the country and the city, between the community and the emancipated individual, is far less resolved in Burying the Girl than in Border Country. This persistent distance between the country and the city will have much to do with the third difference, the different roles of the media in both novels. I don't have time to go into Border Country, but I would call Burying the Girl and its sequel, about which I will be discussing shortly, a sort of media novel. In these novels, the presence of the media in a broad sense seems decisive, not only because they describe the COVID situation, but surely this situation brings the presence of the media, and more importantly, the mediated nature of a reality into relief. For instance, Fuyuko spends an evening at hotel in her hometown in this way, I quote, "At 7 in the evening, access the online New Year's party that I have promised with my friends in Tokyo. Place my iPad on the hotel bed and participated in an online savannah tour to Kenya conducted by HIS on Zoom. Mute Zoom and access Clubhouse on iPhone and talk only with sound with my friends. Eating the remnant of the cake I bought in the afternoon, gaze at rhinos and zebras far away in Africa. The world is now such a small place with these conveniences, as if Tokyo and Kenya were just in front of me." Unquote. All through the novella, Fuyuko seems most at home when she connects with helpful friends in Tokyo through these gadgets. This euphoric vision about technology and media will have a rude awakening in the controversy that ensued from this work. On the 25th of August, the translator and critic Yukiko Konosu published a review which featured Burying the Girl in the Asahi Shimbun, a national newspaper which repeatedly appeared in Burying the Girl itself. Konosu summarized the novella as the story of a mother abusing her husband under her care. Sakuraba quickly responded on Twitter and claimed that that summary was totally inappropriate and that her mother had never abused her husband during the time he had been ill. This controversy involved not only Sakuraba and Konosu, but respective media, Bungakukai and the Asahi Shimbun, and incited a broad debate not only on the validness of their claims, but about the nature of such autobiographical fiction and the relationship between writers and critics. Konosu and the Asahi Shimbun finally published a correction article on the web, which stressed that the synopsis had been Konosu's interpretation. In addition to this, the Asahi published an article featuring this issue, and in it, both Sakuraba and Konosu were given an opportunity to defend their cases. And this was not the end of the story. Sakuraba published a sequel to Burying the Girl under the title Chimera, The Aftermath of Burying the Girl, in the November issue of Bungakukai, which just came out only 2 weeks ago. This work is still more like nonfiction than Burying the Girl is, although the protagonist's name is fictional Fuyuko, and Konosu is just called by the alphabet C, which may stand for critics, at the same time as it insinuates the sound of Konosu's name. Otherwise, this work recounts what happened in reality after she published Burying the Girl, even quoting Konosu's review in full. And yet, this work is still presented as a work of fiction, and certainly with details and narrative contrivances, which make it not just a tract to defend her position. I want to make a judgment here as to which party was right in their argument. Instead, I want to focus on the reason why Sakuraba resorted to such strong measures. She even sent emails to her editors in the Asahi Shimbun, telling them that she would no longer write for the Asahi if no appropriate action was taken. The reason was perceived cultural divide between Tokyo and Tottori. Sakuraba was convinced that people in her hometown would believe blindly whatever the Asahi Shimbun said. On the other hand, they will never think of buying Bungakukai, a highbrow literary journal, to read her novella and make sure what is really written in it. In addition to this, her people will never understand the subtle argument concerning the fictionality of her novella. They will believe what is told is what happened. In short, she was afraid that people in Tottori will believe that her mother abused her husband under her care. You may see that this vision of cultural divide is coextensive with the division of her communities. In Sakuraba's vision, her country is the place of patriarchy and collectivism, of ignorance and illiteracy. When the Asahi Shimbun decides to publish a featured article, giving space to both Sakuraba and Konosu, she asks the newspaper to put her article on the right-hand side. Note that Japanese is written vertically and columns are ordered from right to left. This means that people begin to read from the top right of the newspaper, and Sakuraba, or Fuyuko, insisted to be put on the right, as the people in Tottori may not have the patience to read through all the article, leaving the left-hand side unread. I'm not trying to say that she's suffering from a false division and her worries are totally groundless. I don't doubt that her view of the poor literacy of her people grew out of her actual experience. And importantly, this actual experience is not just direct experiences of human interactions, but the experience of media or mediated but actual experience. As I mentioned earlier, together with Burying the Girl, the aftermath of Burying the Girl can be read as a media fiction. On the one hand, we have conventional media like newspapers, literary magazines, popular weekly magazines, and television and the radio plays an important role at the last moment. On the other hand, we have new personal media like Twitter, Clubhouse, and Zoom. The significations of these media change over the course of the two novellas. As we saw, Fuyuko lived comfortably in the community of friends created by the latter media, and it is those devices and media that make it possible for her to do her writer's work wherever she is. And the former conventional media, by being platforms for her as a famous writer, allowed her to escape from her home. But these media turn against her, especially in the second novella. Twitter becomes a battlefield where she has always to adjust her goals and her battlefront and to contrive new strategies. And the conventional media, especially the Asahi Shimbun, turns into a gigantic bureaucratic apparatus, which it seems totally impossible for an individual's powers to effect any change to. Thus, the two novellas are not just return of the native stories, but an exploration into the problems of how our communities and societies are imagined and made real through the experience of the media. Of course, such imagination can fail, as Fuyuko herself thought that C's, the critic's, imagination had failed. But this doesn't mean that Fuyuko assumes the imagination of herself to be unfailing. In the last few pages of the aftermath, Fuyuko ponders over the passing reference made by C to the fact that C herself was a young carer, and she failed to come to terms with her mother and survived her to her remorse. Fuyuko tries to imagine C's life, begins to imagine that C was also a buried girl, and that experience might have led to the misinterpretation of her novella. But then she checks such thoughts, saying to herself, I quote, "We can never know others, and we should leave the unknowable unknown and patiently live with that fact," unquote. In a short epilogue, however, this decision is once again overturned. In a coffee shop, she suddenly sees a chimera in front of her, and she thinks, I quote, "Until now, I have repeatedly written about girls who are at most moments unnegotiable, unintelligible others. If she doesn't disappear, this ex-girl might become one of them, in a different shape and in a different name and transmigrated. Then from somewhere, I heard a high laughing voice of a man like a villain from a superhero movie. Whose voice is that, I thought. Then this time, unmistakably in my own voice, it rang in my head. I'm glad that you came, Chimera. I will write about you," unquote. By declaring that she will write about the chimera, the buried girl, whom she imagined repeatedly in her fiction, she's making a final distance. Making a distance here means being a writer. Being a writer means being a part of the media itself. So Fuyuko's journey comes to an end by her becoming a media herself. Finally, what we need to ask is this. What then do these novellas tell us about our true social present? What do they tell us about our emergent or even pre-emergent communication and community? My reading is that the problem of distance and cultural division remains unresolved at the denouement of these novellas. Fuyuko certainly decides to keep writing to become a media herself. This decision is, on the one hand, a decision to keep imagining even her opponent's life. This imagining of others' lives is an attempt to make sense of different and otherwise unintelligible images of society. But on the other hand, that decision cannot but be a decision to take a final distance from those at home, those who don't have the patience to read the left-hand side of the newspaper. In addition, the success of Fuyuko's desperate efforts to establish her community through new media is ambiguous at the best. Through the controversy, Twitter turns out to be nothing but a space that effectively divides friends and enemies. The radio, which is given an inscrutable presence in the last part of the novella, may be some third utopian space between the conventional media and new social media. But that at least is the result of Fuyuko's and Sakuraba's efforts to make sense of her media experience as a whole, or to use the word freely, the flow of her diverse media experience. The image of society given from this flow is divisive after all, but that's not her fault. This is the place where we start, and that's where our challenge is. And Fuyuko's far-fetched goal may have been expressed by Raymond Williams in his short writing on the industrial working class, in which workers are depicted as appropriating tools of industrial production, including telephone and telegraph, to create their own community. These tools with prefixes tele are tools to create a distant community or community in distance. I quote from Raymond Williams, "At the same time, by the very fact of the railway, with the trains passing through from the cities, from the factories, from the ports, from the collieries, and by the fact of the telephone and telegraph, which was especially important for the signalmen, who through it had a community with other signalmen over a wide social network, talking beyond their work with men they might never actually meet, but whom they knew very well through voice and opinion and story. They were part of a modern industrial working class," unquote. I hope that this meeting of ourselves is an emergent form of this community in distance. Thank you for listening.
While you were speaking then, Merrin Williams joined us. I can see Merrin's slide here. Just to say welcome, Merrin. It's always good to see you. Merrin, for those of you who do not know, is Raymond Williams's daughter and has been immensely supportive of all the initiatives we've been engaged in Swansea over the years.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I'm delighted to be here.
Great. It's great to have you. Fine. Well, we'll move on then to the closing paper of today's memorable seminar on Raymond Williams, or the uses of Raymond Williams in Japan. And I've invited my good friend Dai Smith to join us. Dai is, of course, well known to many of you. And as he mentioned earlier, we went to Japan together 11 years ago now on the invitation of Yasuo Kawabata, who I see here behind the slide as well. It's good to have you with us as well, Yasuo. Well, we engaged with several of the people who've spoken today. I was Raymond Williams Chair at Swansea University and Vice Chancellor at Glamorgan, Head of English Language Broadcasting at BBC Wales, a central figure in Welsh culture in all kinds of ways, and perhaps mainly known of Raymond Williams and the author of A Warrior's Tale that came out initially in 2008, I'm going to try and remember, and has just been republished now for the centenary year. Well, I've welcomed you already, Dai, but I'll pass the reins over, and thanks very much for joining us today.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Just in terms of time, are we curtailed now?
No, you're fine. You're fine.
Well, let me hold a flag up for the novel before I do anything else. As an historian and a biographer, as Daniel knows, in my recent latter years, I've taken to writing fiction. Most of my friends and enemies think I've been writing fiction all my life, but at least I've made it explicit this time. And I do think that Raymond would have said and did say that the novel, like so many other things, will have to change and to be more creative to encapsulate that structure of feeling that we've all talked about. So I don't think the novel or fiction, in my view, is in any sense dead. What's been strange today, apart from the privilege of joining you all, is actually kind of talking and sort of seeing oneself at the same time. It's almost as sort of a weird cinematic experience for a lecturer who is used merely to throwing it out there. I call mine a member of the awkward squad because I want to say a few things about the way in which Raymond's life, I believe, not just throws light on his work, but actually leads us down paths which sometimes, because of the power of that work, we've been reluctant to tread. So I'm going to start with that dictum of, let's trust the tale, not the teller, and reverse it. Trust the work, we're told, not the viewpoint, not the life. Trust the tale for revelation, for objectivity. Well, in Raymond Williams's case, maybe the opposite is true. Maybe the opposite is true. His work, though complex, of course, is often at its core, despite the different genres in which he worked, at its core is often straightforward. There's a strong sense of rectitude and certainty in most of what Raymond wrote. His life, on the other hand, was often enigmatic, often irresolute. It was often a puzzle in certain decades, even to himself, and it was certainly, in the way in which it was measured out, contradictory. I think the key to his significance through the work, and of course it is the work that makes him so significant, the key to some of that significance might in fact then lie in the details of his life, what I call its specificities, the ambiguities of relationships in that life, and the specifics in relationship to the work, the contorted specifics. This is certainly what I found as a biographer and as an historian, and when Joy Williams in particular gave me carte blanche to delve into the papers, which of course are now in Swansea. And I think the upshot of the biography in the end, which I wrote, which of course dealt with the first 40 years, and I suppose therefore really was about the making of Raymond Williams rather than the public Raymond Williams that we've been talking about mostly today. The impetus of that biography in the end is that Culture and Society, his 1958 publication, which made him famous, that came out of Border Country, the novel, which was effectively finished in 1956-57, although not published till 1960. So the other way around, really, than the chronology. Merin, sorry.
Sorry.
Should I go on?
Sorry.
You're supposed to mute your mic, Merin.
I will.
For someone who was so specific, Raymond, I mean, who was so rooted, working class, obviously, Welsh, socialist, rooted in his life and in his work, he's traveled the world, his ideas, his critical forays into literature, communications, ecology, and so on. He's traveled the world with surprising ease from that particular background. His specific nature that I've just referred to somehow becoming abstract or general enough to embody the circumstances, the questions, the dilemmas, the social and individual dilemmas of others, from Brazil to Japan, from Germany to Argentina, from England to Italy, as your seminars have been showing. Somehow France, I don't know, is always just about the exception. So this isn't only impressive in terms of Raymond, it's welcome, of course, in its universal transcendence of the local, whether geographically or as historical tradition. But as I say, as his biographer and as an historian in a broader sense of Wales and 20th century Britain, I want to try to cast a slightly different light on the concept of Raymond as an everyman traveling about in a positive sense. And I would suggest that part of his broad appeal actually lies in his protean profile, that is, an all-embracing mode, sometimes which allowed him in his work to pivot from one position to another, apparently without hesitation. And yet, I want to say in the paper that there was a core to his life and to his work to which he remained stubbornly committed. His origins, or as we heard earlier on, his beginnings, that's a better word, I think, that journey, his beginnings in the border country between Wales and England was the means in his fiction as well as in his life by which he measured himself and thereby spoke to so many. In the 1950s, before he was really famous for anything, he seemed either uncertain of himself or an enigma to others, to those with whom he worked. He said of himself in 1948, which is a strange year in British terms to disavow politics, you might think, he said of himself, and I quote, "My separation from the possibilities of political action and collaboration was complete, and that for him, there was a breakdown of any collective project that I could perceive, political, literary, or cultural." And in fact, as we now know, he gave up looking at newspapers even for quite a long time. Further, up until about 1956, he said the answer to whether, he was often asked the question by colleagues and comrades, the answer to the question, he said, whether he was a communist or not, that the answer was yes and no. Where there were disputes within adult education, and they were fierce within the Oxford extramural department at the time, there was a kind of a witch hunt against communist adult educators. Where there were these disputes and the debates around political matters, in a wider sense, he was, in the eyes of many, aloof. He was certainly ambivalent, and he said he was considered the worst of all things by these comrades, neither positive, he said, nor negative, but he was considered, and it's Raymond's words, a maverick. Or, as I've tried to entitle this paper, a member of the awkward squad. I use that as a term of praise. At Hay on Wye, when I was chairing a session some time ago before the biography, and David Hare, the playwright who was one of Raymond's pupils at Cambridge, was in the audience and made a passing remark to Raymond as a Marxist. Joy from the back, I don't think you were there, Merrin, but Joy from the back of the audience said, "My husband was not a Marxist. My husband was never a Marxist." Well, you could have fooled a lot of people a lot of the time by saying that. But I think in a deep sense, it was not wrong. Joy was not wrong. As a revolutionary, if we want to use one of those terms for Marxism, he was always in waiting. He was always actually disappointed. He was always dreaming. Consider his relationship with the British Labour Party. By the 1960s, Raymond said, the British Labour Party was no longer a social democratic party. The kind of party in the 1940s, which up until 1948, he had certainly supported in the ways in which it was trying to transform British society, albeit not in a revolutionary manner. But by the 1960s, Raymond was clear, although he often campaigned for them, it was no longer a social democratic party. In fact, he said the Labour Party was an upholder of managerial capitalism, that it had become, simply by being elected, a barrier to revolution. That the Labour Party, he said, was a party to be voted for on one day, and then on the very next day to be fought. And yet, in the upheaval of the 1970s, when British society, again, the great miners' strikes of 72 and 74, and that maelstrom of revolt happening, the Labour Party, he felt, had to be supported, absolutely, certainly, because otherwise the alternative to that was even more dreadful. And more importantly, there is this, as he saw it in the late 1970s, and I'm going to quote, if I can find it from, Politics and Letters, where he talks about the Labour Party and in a broader sense, other things. He says, there must be something in every socialist, from the very values involved in wanting socialism at all, wanting a revolution to bring about socialism, rather than just wanting a revolution, that continually pulls towards precisely the compromises, the settlements, the getting through without too much trouble and suffering, that is the great resource of longing by the people on which the capitalist parties draw. And then this, perhaps I feel this especially strongly, for until one has realized what has actually happened to people who have suffered as the objects of history, he's talking about the Great Depression and wars, one cannot understand the depth of this desire, which is more than the ideological effect of those parties and institutions which seek to defuse intolerable contradictions, managerial capitalism, in order to preserve the system. And he says it's only when people get to the point of seeing that the price of contradictions is yet more intolerable than the price of ending them that they acquire the nerve to go. And it's at that point that he says that I think that the battle for those kind of people to be, if you like, within and without Labour Party politics, the battle is for those kind of people to win them over hearts and minds, because unless you can take out a very significant proportion of them from the Labour Party, this is in 1979, he says there isn't a future for socialism in Britain. But in his life at the same time, grappling with these things as he was throughout the 70s, he starts coming to other conclusions. And one of those conclusions maybe was that there should be no Britain, that Britain itself was one of the things that was allowing the failure of the breakthrough, certainly of any kind of socialist breakthrough. And he begins to look for a different way out, another bolt hole or loophole, perhaps is a better way of putting it. And it's as he discovered a more conscious sense, going back to cultural specificities, a more conscious sense of his Welshness from the 1960s and 70s, he says when he met with Welsh intellectuals and writers as never before, and it was certainly at that time that I and my generation were meeting with Raymond face to face, and he made this famous in Wales anyway, declaration that I want to refer to, if I may, very briefly. He talks about this period. He says, "I was suddenly a Welsh European, and both levels felt different. There's still a lot to work through from that, but I can hardly describe the difference of talking and relating now in Wales." He's talking about the early mid-1970s, "with writers and political comrades who are all hard up against it, against the failure of change. What seen from outside Wales is a remarkable vitality, and so it objectively is. But there in Wales, it's a hard, fierce, internally contending, yet bitterly communal feeling, which is also where I happen to be now, and in the truest sense to be from. Through the intricacies of the politics, and they are very intricate indeed, I want the Welsh people, still a radical and cultured people, to defeat, override, or bypass bourgeois England. The alternatives follow from the intricacies. That connects for me with a sense in my work that I am now necessarily European." And then he goes on, and I paraphrase a bit. He says, "At least I am in a culture where I can breathe, or at least take breaths, to go back and contend with capitalist Europe, capitalist England, and blast it, but it was there and has to be shown, capitalist Wales." And those, not contradictions, but that balance is, I think, exactly what made Raymond so important for so many of us at that time, that he understood, and that he understood the intricacies. But that was published in 1979, the Politics and Letters, the very year, of course, in which the referendum on devolution for Wales, forms of autonomous government, was decisively defeated by the so-called radical Welsh people, and put back another 20 years. Raymond's politics, I'm saying, were always principled, but in practical terms, they were often dismissive of the compromises of electoral politics. They were certainly suspicious even of electoral democracy, parliamentary democracy, and he saw it as a manipulative tool of capitalism. And he was not convinced either, and this is crucial, by any herd mentality under the rubric of solidarity, that you support working class politics, trade union activity, no matter what. He says on more than one occasion that solidarity is something to be worked through and to be understood. Which takes me back, if I may, to his beginnings and to the specificities which I think truly defined him throughout his life, and even led him on to those abstractions or critiques for which he became a vehicle, a conduit across the world. And these specificities, for me, are class, culture, community, consciousness. I believe that he had witnessed their actual experience combination, the combination of those things, class, culture, community, consciousness, in his early life. And that for the rest of his life, he sought institutional means, abstract if you will, he sought institutional means to maintain those qualities and those values for a wider and more sustainable hegemony outside of the specificities. This was his long revolution. It was as he recorded it and as he envisaged its future. If you think of the opposites he united in his famous phrases, and they've been used severally by participants today, phrases in which emotion or sensibility, if you will, are attached to experience or living, softer words to harder words. That's how I see it. The most famous of them being the structure of feeling. Structure, feeling. It's not a word that you would normally put with feeling. Raymond first uses that phrase, if I remember rightly, in 1954, when he writes his first book on drama. The structure of feeling. It's a brilliant insight, but what exactly does it mean? Cultural, soft, materialism, hard, cultural materialism, a whole way of life, and of course, famously, culture and society. He didn't shy away from trying to make that unity, what I will call here a creative unity, and in his first creative phrase. And he's extremely interesting as well about using the word creativity to mean something that you have to undergo before you get to consciousness. So how it was in Border Country, the novel, how it can go forward in the dynamism of his conclusions to culture and society. The circumstances in which he wrote in the late 1950s in Britain, the social and cultural context of Britain and so on, are of course changed, inevitably and beyond reparation probably. The potential for political power that he saw in that late industrial working class, even in the 1950s, has also by now inevitably shapeshifted into an uncertain mixture of various shorthand term identity politics. There probably isn't a working class political hegemony possible in Britain anymore, because there isn't, in the sense that Raymond would have understood it historically, a working class that translates into political action in that way. But the principles and the values that he asserted and asserts throughout seem to me to be as wise as they are deeply humane, awkward, difficult, if you like. He doesn't give us an easy way out. He is stubborn in his specificities. And this is what he affirms from what he had seen and felt, I believe, in his upbringing. So, and again, people have referred to this, there are no such thing as the masses. There are only ways of seeing people in that way. And Raymond's ability to hold together an understanding that individuals are shaped in their social, in their consciousness, sorry, in their private consciousness by social and societal factors, but that is not to gainsay that their individuality is not the key element to their humanity. He will not turn away from a sense of individuated life. And he will not turn away either from the sense that creative activity, and this comes out of Culture and Society in the conclusion, I won't go to that because we may run out of time. Creative activity, he says very, very explicitly, is not confined to the educated, is not confined to the literate, is not confined to ideas. He says that you should look at other skills, and he actually says from gardening to metalwork to carpentry to active politics, that these are all examples, not just of human intelligence, but of human creativity, and not to be put to one side, low culture, if you will, against high culture. And that's why in that same wonderful dynamic conclusion, he talks about the collective institutional culture of the working class. And he's referring historically now from, let's say, the 1830s through to the 1940s or 50s, the collective institutional culture of the working class. And he says trade unions, political parties, voluntary associations, cooperatives, and it's Raymond's phrase that the collective institutional culture was a remarkable creative achievement. That's what I mean by saying he looked for an institutional hegemony to take forward other forms of creativity. He says the making of a community, that noble community, if you like, as Daniel said, that the making of a community is never a given, is never static. It is always an exploration. It always changes. The making of a community is an exploration because consciousness, an understanding of it, a belief in it, cannot precede its creation. You have to create the community and in order for the consciousness to follow. So it's back to my sense of Border Country precedes the culture and society, that the life of the fiction, the lived experience precedes our understanding, definitions of the sociologies of culture and so on. Or, as he puts it, in Border Country, and it's right towards the end of the book, where there's a conversation between Will, who is Matthew Price, the son of Harry Price, the railway signalman who was dying, and Morgan Rosser, who is the explicit socialist in the book, and as opposed to Harry, who is, should we say, the working man, and they're discussing what Harry at his death was about. And Will says, what did you want, Morgan? And Morgan, you remember, what goes on to become a successful businessman. And Morgan says, I learned something, Will, something that in general, we all know about, but I learned it from him. He couldn't see life as chances. Everything with him was to settle. He took his own feelings and he built things from them. He lived direct, never by any other standard at all. You built from your own feelings too, Morgan. Yes, in a way, at least I tried to, but what were those feelings? Negative feelings, Will, because what I wanted, I couldn't have. What did you want? I wanted, said Morgan, a socialist society. When my business got going, I went into politics. I'm in a position to laugh. But, says Will, we're getting some improvement in our own time. No, Will, we're not. We're getting the result of our own denying. We're getting it all except the life. I'm sorry, I don't follow what you're saying. What in fact are we to do? Start our businesses, Will. Make our careers. What else? You're implying there is something else. What we talk about, Will, he's lived. It all depends on a mind to it, a will to it, a society or anything else. And the mind we're making isn't the society we want, although we still say we want it. The mind he's got is to the things we say really matter. We say it and run off in the opposite direction. And that's why Harry's different. He changes a thing because he wants the new thing, and he settles to it because he wants it right through, not because the rejection is driving him. And that, I think, is another way of arguing that it's more about feelings that are experienced than structures that are obtained. Or in other words, if you want to obtain the structure to build that broader, wider social being, then you have to have a different kind of lived experience. And that, I think, is the long revolution that actually is always present in Raymond, that it's learning how to live against the odds within your life until the consciousness is created, and only thereafter being able to reach out for the broader things. Or if I'll cheat and end with this phrase, I always think that in the end, Raymond Williams is more Charles Dickens than he is Karl Marx. Thank you.